Back when I was in theological school, we didn't have these here fancy things. We had overhead projectors you could draw on, stuff like that. Jim Cooper was getting into computers. He let me borrow his, and I was the first theological school student to produce an index for his dissertation. And did it look good on that little dot matrix printer? Thank you, Jim. So we did have, though, copies of Bishop DeCharmes's a commentary on a harmony of the four Gospels, and that's what I'm holding up in front of you. Bishop DeCharmes spent his whole life studying the life of the Lord, and also, he wrote Growth of the Mind. He came out of an era that was just steeped in this desire to correlate the things that are like from the scientific works and the philosophic works with the writings. And so he was on the tail end of that era. So he loved correlating what he could find in the stories of the Word in the New Testament with stories from the Old Testament and see how there were these stages and the Lord went to Jerusalem and came back and then went and came back, and you could make seven days out of that, or 7 journeys and times that the Lord went into Jerusalem out again. So in this book, which is a harmony of the gospel, but he calls it a commentary on it. It's a great book. It's filled with pretty much just following the story of the Lord's, the Gospels, and obviously a harmony of the gospel. So he'll put each of the passages one after the other that are on a certain subject, and then he'll comment. And I think probably the most often repeated phrase found in this book is, the reason this is said this way in the Gospel of Mark, but said that way in the Gospel of Luke, we don't know. But I'm sure it has something to do with the internal sense, and future scholars will reveal this. Like every other page, because it's not specifically explained everywhere why Matthew, Mark, and Luke so go into the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane, and John basically said they went there. And then next thing is the Lord's being arrested. I know you can't see this really well. I'm going to walk by you with it. But here is this section, starting with the Passover, the prayer at Gethsemane, betrayal, the arrest, the crucifixion. And it shows Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which ones of the Gospels cover these particular stories. So you can see gaps in a lot of these. And you can see places where John is solid and the other Gospels aren't talking about certain things. Does that make sense? Can you sort of tell? So Matthew's pretty solid, does a big block in here. And the understanding is that perhaps Mark wrote his Gospel first, and then Matthew and Luke kind of looked at his and added things. And then John, basically, it's a completely different book. John, who also wrote the book of Revelation, as you know, very different book. So you'll look at these sheets. This is the section 6, so he calls this the 6th day, and he's correlating it with certain parts out of the Old Testament related to the kings. The Gospel of John doesn't easily fit in, and the scholars have observed that since forever. They call the first 3 the synoptic Gospels, because they sort of follow in a series, sort of unified, and then John is the non-synoptic gospel, I suppose. So I had a lovely time just reading through DeCharmes's commentary about the Garden of Gethsemane. So the Lord called together his disciples on Thursday and said, we're going to go to the upper chamber, and we're going to have this supper. And so the story related to the Last Supper takes place. And then he left there after he sang a hymn. And make sure I can do this right. How's that showing up? Pretty well. I don't know if the light on dark is as good as the other way around. So when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, Olivet. Jesus said to them, all of you will be offended because of me this night, for it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. That's a prophecy from the Old Testament. Now, striking the shepherd, does that mean he's going to die or just kind of go down? But after I am risen, I will go before you to Galilee. Did they understand risen like risen from the dead like Lazarus? Or they just, what's going to happen? They, in one sense, quote unquote, should have known because the Lord had been telling them. But all of us who have had children, raising little people, we tell them over and over again, and then all of a sudden they get what we're talking about. And the disciples really didn't get a lot of what the Lord said. We have the advantage of the story being written out and explained to us over and over again. They were seeing all of this unfolding for the first time. And although they may have known the stories, I'm not exactly sure who of them could read and write. We would assume Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could because they wrote those Gospels. But the rest of them, I don't know. Could Peter read and write? He was a fisherman. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but the point is they likely weren't very well scripted in the Old Testament. They were following this man because he called them, and he said, I'll make you fishers of men. After I am risen, I will go before you to Galilee. But Peter said to him, although all shall be offended, yet I won't, not I. And Jesus said to him, verily, verily, I say to you that this day, even this night, before the cock crows twice, you shall deny me thrice. And he spoke more vehemently, if I should die with thee, I will not deny thee in any wise. Likewise, they all said. So we're familiar with that highlighted thing where it says, before the cock crows twice, you shall deny me 3 times. It is something that during this time we think, would we have done that, right? Would we have done that? Knowing what we know now, would we have done that? So the lesson I read from the Apocalypse Explains talks about how the Lord took care of them, and he asked them, did you ever need anything when I sent you out? Did you need purse? Did you need shoes? Change of garments? No, Lord. Well, now I'm telling you, if you have a purse, you have a wallet, you have a sword, you're going to need it. And in the internal sense, and it even talks about, as it were, in the natural sense, that the disciples were going to be really challenged now. And everything they knew about the Lord was going to be really needed. They're going to need every little coin of truth to keep them in the faith. And, in fact, they all lost their faith. Peter being the chief one who said vehemently, I would never deny you. And they all said it. And then they all rejected him. They came to a place which was named Gethsemane. Gethsemane means the place of pressing olives. But evidently it had not been used that way for a long time. And it was a garden, but it had olives, a lot of olive trees. I asked my students today, talking about this story, so what do you do with olives? How do you get olive oil? And some of them said, well, you boil the leaves in water. I said, well, that would make some tea, I guess. But so we have no experience. Who has ever pressed olives? You might have pressed lemons and oranges to make lemon and orange juice, but which of us has that experience of pressing olives? But being in Gethsemane, the place of pressing olives, the Lord is going to be sorely pressed and squeezed spiritually, naturally. He's bleeding. He's sweating blood. An image that pretty much under a lot of pressure, we would say. They came to a place called Gethsemane. He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, and began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Then said he unto them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even unto death. Tarry ye here, and watch with me. And he went a little further, and in the gospel I read it, a stone's throw. He fell on his face, he prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. The cup. Earlier in the Gospels it says, Jesus said to the sons of Zebedee, James and John, you do not know what you ask. The mother had said, can they sit with him on either side and rule with him in the kingdom? Are you able to drink the cup that I shall drink of? And he said to Peter in another part of the Gospels, the cup which my Father has given me, shall I not drink it? So we know cup represents the things that are holding the temptations in this context. In other contexts, cup could mean different things. And of course, we know from the way the word is written, one word can have various meanings according to the context. So this cup that's going to pass from him, he's facing death. And he knows it. Of course he knows it. He knows all things from his state of glorification, from his state of wisdom. He knows all things. But he's going to go through states where all those things disappear from his awareness. The cup. In Mark, he began to be terrified, sorely troubled. He said to his disciples, "My soul is encompassed with sorrow even unto death." Well, yes, he was considering his death. He knew, "Judas, what you're going to do it quickly." He said, "One of you will betray me." They asked who it was, and the Lord identified the one who puts their hand into the sop, or the sauce, the dish with me. And it was Judas, and he said, "Go, do what you must do quickly." Sorrowful even unto death. And he went forward a little, fell upon the ground, prayed, if it were possible, the hour might pass away from him. He said, "Father, all things are possible unto thee. Remove this cup from me, albeit not as I will, but as thou wilt." And he spake a second time, and a third time. From these passages we see that what was the nature of the Lord's temptations, that they were the most horrible of all. That he felt anguish from the very inmost, even to the sweating of blood, and that he was then in a state of despair concerning the end and the event. So why are those two words in there, the end and the event? Is that because one's spiritual and the other's natural? He was in despair concerning the end and the event. And also that he had consolations. We know that an angel came to strengthen him, it says. The end is the salvation of the whole human race. The event is the death of his physical body. He had been living a life, 33 years, we believe, of being challenged to understand who he was as to his divine soul, and what was this vessel, this body into which this divine soul had been born incarnate. And we barely understand what that means, but we're told about it over and over again in the teachings of the new church. And also he had consolations. The word now under consideration, and this goes back to Abraham, the Lord speaking to Abraham, "I, Jehovah, am thy shield and thy exceedingly great reward." These involve in like manner consolation after the combats and temptations treated of in the foregoing chapter. So I'm skipping from the Gospels to the Arcana explaining Genesis, right? You're following along. We have all three testaments here. So the Lord is being consoled after temptation, during temptation. 1, 2, 3 times he goes out, prays, comes back in. Disciples are sleeping. Goes back out, comes back in. Disciples are sleeping. Goes back out, comes back in. It's like our own lives of the wavering, the back and forth. But what was to be accomplished by means of his death? So there are different views, right? Gethsemane was a premonition of the cross. We know the Lord was now at this last time with his disciples, doing all that he could to be with them, and yet in agony. Would the Lord have wanted to separate from them and be by himself for one or other particular reason? It doesn't say he did this because he had to figure something out or whatever. It was because he was in severe agony about the end and the event. Will people be saved by this? Will all that I have done, all these miracles, feeding thousands of people, raising people from the dead, walking on water, all those things that naturally appeal to us when we think about who Jesus is, but then all the interior things that we couldn't see but were introduced to them in the teachings of the new church, all those interior things the Lord was going through. The old idea, an old idea that you can get from those things of the natural sense of the New Testament, if his death was a sacrifice to the vindictive justice of God, then in his suffering on the cross, he indeed drank the wrath of the Almighty God. And you can see how easy you could get that picture. Why are you going through this? Why do you have to die? Don't die. Simon said, don't die. Peter said, don't die, he said. And the Lord said, get thee behind me, Satan. You savor the things of the world and of man and not the things of God. But people can look at what he was doing and say, well, he's doing something with the Father. The Father's doing something to him. He's got to be a sacrifice. We've all been raised to understand we sacrifice things. This is God's lamb, the sacrifice. So it will appease the justice of God, angry Jehovah. So at Gethsemane, he was encountering the frown of God. And if so, then may he well have prayed that the cup might pass from him. Oh Lord, figure out another way. Father, figure out, isn't there some other way? I've been born into this body. And we kind of do this separation thing of the divine Jesus and the divine Father. It's easy to do in Gethsemane because here this man is sweating blood because he's gonna die. Can this cup pass from me? Can I be let out of this? Is this arrangement got to happen? All these things you had written in the... Well, maybe we can understand them differently. Did the Lord actually consider any of those things, or does it just look like he did? The frown of God can only foretell of his abandonment to the curse that rested upon all men for their disobedience. Now, this quote from Gethsemane down to disobedience is more or less something out of a sermon from N.D. Pendleton on the Gethsemane, written back in 32. I love those Pendleton scholars. Did he have to die? All temptations involve death. There's death in them all. The Lord's temptations from the very first temptations, carried the quote-unquote sign of the cross, the sign of death, going to the cross. Well, they exceeded our measure. We can't understand them. Yet we have the likeness of his suffering in all of our human experiences. And from these we may gain a comparative idea sufficient for our understanding and our faith. The Lord's going to meet us where we can meet him. We may understand and have faith in that which was accomplished in him. He suffered a lot to achieve an end, and he went to an event, leading to an event, his own death. So the teachings of the new church, what we would call the new doctrine concerning this, reveals an ordeal of his death that was brought on by a unified assault of all evil, all the hells, and in the end, even the proprium of all in the heavens were seeking supremacy in his death. If we can kill him, we've won. Even the angels, they didn't want to see him dead, but something that they had to have touched within their own lives. They had to be redeemed and saved too on a certain level, that they may not be attacked again the same way they were being attacked. So both doctrines agree that in the final crisis, that is the doctrine of the quote-unquote old Christian church before the new church, agree in the final crisis that he seemed to himself to be forsaken of God. Is that obvious or what? But they do not agree as to the cause of the sense of abandonment. Why would Jehovah abandon his son? Because he's a nasty God? Because that's how he works? That's how he operates? Or do you come up with an answer? The vengefulness of God demands that, the justice of God demands that somebody die. The older doctrine teaches that this sacrifice, the wrath of God, was diverted by the sacrifice from men and centered upon Jesus. A wrath which could find no appeasement until its indignation discovered a victim in the only begotten Son. Jesus is thought to be a willing victim, offered by mutual divine consent to the end that men may be forgiven. Strange way of understanding it, but if you don't have the teachings of the new church, what do you make of the whole story, but especially, here's Jesus, the Garden of Gethsemane. He's had this nice supper with his disciples. He doesn't have to go there. He's hidden from them over and over again. If the time wasn't right, he slipped out. They didn't catch him. But when the time was right, he just waits. Waits for Judas. Waits for the army from the temple police, scribes and Pharisees, and then a bunch of other people, guards and captains and other people. This is going to be an exciting thing happening tonight. Let's see what it is. They had already paid him, Judas, 30 pieces of silver. That's not, extra spending money. That's a lot of money to do this. Make it easy. Let's get one of his own disciples to take us where he's going to be that night. He slipped away from us a couple different times now. We're going to get him. And did the Lord put up a fight? No, but he talked about swords with his disciples, and so they pull out a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. The new doctrine, the teachings of the new church show that his death or temptation as a conclusive victory over evil, whereby a person is liberated from self-imposed evil bondage. The Lord did that for us. He freely allowed himself to be crucified so that he could freely be resurrected. The new doctrine shows the result of his final temptation as the completion of the Lord's glorification for the sake of man's liberation. A lot of doctrinal jargon, doctrinal ideas in the way I write sometimes. And our new doctrine sees his glorification as progressive, and in this sense not unlike our own regeneration. So we see this as a model because we've been led to understand that. And it couldn't be otherwise, for the Lord was born as a man and subject to the human frailties that we all have, the afflictions of the flesh, and every evil temptation. Unless he, not be. Unless he had been reborn unto God, that is, glorified and unified, he could not in the end have presented himself as the glorified God-man, one of the phrases in the writings, the Savior of the race. To this end and to this sense, in this sense, he bore our iniquities. He didn't actually sin, as we know. But he bore our iniquities, everything, every evil that we're capable of, and even the ones we don't think we're capable of, that we're really capable of. The Lord experienced the hell from which that evil comes. The Lord had contact with the thought and the falsity from which that falsity arises. But why was there this appearance of him being forsaken of God? Why couldn't the Lord just go into his temptations knowing, I know that things are going to be okay because I'm doing this and I'm God? Why? Why did he have to feel like, or did he not have to feel like, he'd been completely left alone? Was he completely left alone? What do you think? Nobody has any idea, huh? You're afraid to answer. Don't want to get it wrong. What do you think, Barb? Was he left alone?
Well, I think he felt that he was left alone. I don't think he really was.
But he's the Lord. Couldn't he overcome that feeling?
I don't know.
Well, he knew he had to do it, otherwise everything would fail. Certain things you have to do, you don't want to do them, but you do them because it's the right thing to do.
So he's getting all these divine perceptions, and he's reading the word of the Old Testament. He's seeing the internal sense, the spiritual, the celestial, the divine sense. So he knows all these things, so why would he feel alone if he's got all those things in his divine mind?
Well, he's shedding his human.
Right.
Which is like us, we have to give up things that we care about. I mean, he grew up with it for 33 years, so.
Took over, huh? But isn't that a weakness? Wouldn't you consider that a flaw, that Jesus would give in to that human?
That was the temptation for him to feel that way, right?
But he never succumbed to temptation, so wouldn't that be succumbing in temptation?
No, because he said, thy will be done.
So the Lord is actually Jehovah's actually desiring him to feel rotten and feel alone and abandoned. Thy will, that God's will is that I suffer.
It's just part of the process.
Yeah. It was
God wills that
sadness.
it be done.
You think? Jim, what do you think? You got a little bit of a look on your face that...
Watching you set up straw men to knock.
Oh, stop it. That's...
There you are. You got it.
Jim, I thought about you when I looked at the... Because I don't do PowerPoints very often. Jared's great at it, but I don't do them very much. I thought about you when I looked at...
Can't be temptation unless there's doubt concerning the end,
Why?
because that's the rule.
Well, Jesus is Jesus. Can't he change the rules?
No, they're his rules.
Oh.
Bingo.
So I thought about you, Jim. I'll tell you why. If you can look really carefully at the background, I was looking for, it said, there's like nature ones, and they were all like, so you can get a bunch of templates to have your backgrounds instead of just a blank piece of paper. So I picked celestial, because what was I thinking, right? Celestial, right? So it'll be like beautiful, and it's, it's about, you can see the, there's a compass that you would have, I guess, flying, and there's another compass, and it's really about Jim flying in his celestial state. Yes.
Well, it's not really a question, but it's more like where you said the end and the event.
The end and the event.
What came to my mind was his death and his resurrection. His glorification, I mean. So why is it whatever you said it was?
Well, I was actually, I didn't look up that translation to see how, or whether they're the same word. The end would be a different end, as in finis, done, finished, as opposed to the end being the goal or the object.
Oh, okay.
So he was looking towards the goal or the end in view. My Latin's not even good enough. Is anybody's Latin good enough to tell me that they're actually two different words? No, end and event are two different words. But to say I'm looking towards a positive end in regard to this doctrinal class, or where I say I'm looking to the end of this doctrinal class, meaning I hope it's finished soon. So something being finished is one kind of end, and something be of end, cause, and effect is another kind of end. I had thought of as the end, cause, and effect. He was looking towards the end, but also the event.
Quote, end and event?
Yeah, end and event from, I don't know which number it was now.
Okay.
I think end.
840.
Finis in Latin has the same range of meaning as
Okay.
end in English.
Okay.
But I think that in the writings it tends towards the sense of goal or destination.
Purpose.
Makes sense.
Okay.
I interpret it as purpose. And the event, which is being nailed on a cross. That's the event. The appearance of being forsaken, it's an illusion. You're not forsaken. But the illusion is most profound in this last and final crisis. With any of us, when we're facing the worst death in our life, and for some of us, it could be the death of our body. For some of us, it could be the death of our partner. Could be the death of a long-loved use that we were performing. We would rather die than see our country taken over by the enemy, zombies, aliens. Well, most aliens' writings tell about it pretty good, but people are willing to die for a good cause, right? For a good end. You're willing to die for it. And so the temptation that comes with being willing to give up your life, or being willing to look at your life ending, or look at the end of your deepest loves, whether you stay alive afterwards or not. People would say, I'd rather be dead. The Lord would rather be dead than see humanity suffer and be damned. And that was what was up at stake. He'd rather die. In every temptation, we seem to ourselves to be forsaken, and this for the most weighty purposes. The vital need is that we should resist as if of ourselves, as if of ourselves. And if there was no aid except within ourselves, it's got to be, we have to have full ownership. No, I was forced into battle. I really didn't want to die. I was forced into temptation. I really didn't want to suffer. No, if we're going to win in something that we really love to see succeed or live, we've got to do it as if of ourselves. Or else it's worthless. We're mercenaries. Spiritual mercenarianism doesn't work. It is in action. It's vital. As if of self, that we draw down and appropriate that high freedom which is the inner gift of God. The Lord is giving us the freedom only and to the extent that we feel this is our own problem that we are solving. So we're said to be in no greater freedom than in temptations. We're in greater freedom in temptations than at any other time. And this then is our great opportunity. We seem to ourselves to have little or no freedom when we are beset by evils, but if we will only resist as if of ourselves, then true freedom is born in our natural and confirmed. So the whole point of spiritual life isn't just to be able to quote the doctrines and to be able to think high thoughts. It's actually to be able to live and love the life that we've been led to live. Love it. Not just do it because we have to, but eventually do it because we want to. And the thing that doesn't want us to do, whatever it is, has to die. So in teaching is that in temptation, during the struggle and unsure times, a person's freedom is more interior. You might not feel it at all. Freedom is there. It's held in reserve, as it were, and increased. The freedom is actually increased, awaiting descent. I don't know if that really makes sense, how that freedom is like an entity existing. Dan Goodenow has a good paper that talks about how we understand that. He gave it to clergy meetings. We resist as if of ourselves when we acknowledge that the power of our resistance is God-given. So those few coins that the Lord said, if you have a purse, you have a wallet, you're going to need them. When we're going through the struggles of temptation, those few coins that tell us we have to go through this, even despite what we feel. And we need to have the sword of truth to fight the falsity that this is worthless, although it's going to feel that way. And we'll actually begin thinking, not worth it. The Lord's temptations were in this kind. Were in kind and aspect not unlike those of every regenerate. Boy, that's a terribly phrased sentence. But they differed from our own temptations in two ways. One was their severity. That we can't even compare how much worse the Lord was feeling what he went through compared to ourselves. If you think you got a handle on it, put the handle down and go, I don't really know. But it was intense. Because the need that he should eradicate all inherited evil from his maternal human. Every hell got a hold of a part of his natural. In his body, in his sensual, in his corporeal, in his imagination, in everything having to do with what it is to be a person on earth. The hell's got a hold of him everywhere. And it's all what we call the merry human. No mere human is capable of this, that is, being attacked by all hell. Even with the help of the Lord, we couldn't do it. The other difference, so the severity is one thing. The other difference is that the fact that the Lord never resisted any evil as if of himself. Got that underlined there? Such resistance would neither have eradicated evil nor glorified as human, as if from himself. Look, as if from himself, but actually it was coming from the Father. No, nothing came to the Lord to give him power over his temptations, as if from himself. With us, it's as if from ourselves, because we're not God. Therefore, it's said to be from the divine himself, the ipse, his soul, which was the whole point of his life, to have that soul be growing and developing and providing everything, including the power to overcome the darkness of feeling completely abandoned and separated from that power. Often it's said that he did everything in his life by his own power. I typed in that phrase, by his own power, and 99 hits came up, and I thought there'd be like 500 or 1,000. And I looked up a bunch of them. I mean, I know what it says. And yeah, over and over again, especially in the Arcana where we're talking about the Lord's developing mind and glorification. By his own power. So this is one of my favorite passages about the Lord by his own power. It's the story of Abraham and Sarah, and they're having the baby Isaac, and Sarah's laughing because she's going to have this baby, and she's going to say people just aren't going to believe a 90-something-year-old woman's having a baby. 100-year-old man's going to be the dad. I don't mean to be casual about it, so excuse me. So people are going to laugh, just going to laugh at this. Who would have said that Sarah's going to nurse sons unto Abraham? Who would have said to Abraham, Sarah will suckle sons? Means that by his own power, the Lord implanted the human within the divine. The human within the divine. Abraham represents divine good, Sarah divine truth. The milk of a nursing mother means that which is spiritual from a celestial origin. Divine. That is, that the nursing means implanting that truth of the divine truth, that truth of the divine human. Passage continues. The reason why, in the internal sense, the words under consideration mean that the Lord, by his own power, implanted the human within the divine, is that divine truth is one and the same as the divine human. And that's what's being represented by Sarah and the nursing and the milk. When in reference to this, it is said to suckle sons or nurse sons to Abraham, meaning that he implanted the human within the divine. And as it was the human he implanted, he did so by his own power. The human as in the divine human, which again, you think, oh, the divine in and of itself, and then the human is the merry thing. No, the Lord took the divine humanity which formed humans on earth and implanted it in that body, in that natural mind, and glorified it. Scarcely any clearer or more intelligible explanation of these matters is possible. This is said over and over again, especially in reference to this one. Could you see Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, this kind of trinity, all a stage of the Lord's own mind? It's all you. Your own mind. You have that good and truth, and then you have the descent of good and truth into usefulness. In raising a family, you have a mom and a dad and a baby needs to be nursed, needs to be fed, so that it can continue to develop. Of course, the Lord is all of those in the sense that in his development, the nursing mother represents the human, the divine human, coming into what is the rational. That's what Isaac represents. It is a doctrinal class. I don't want to get too doctrinal because that's what we're here for. But these things are hard to understand. To say more would obscure still further that which is meant, and as these are divine matters which can be presented to the angels alone by means of celestial and spiritual things. It talks about them seeing light shows. If presented to people in more exalted manner, these things would fall into material and bodily ideas which people possess. A lot about the Lord's life, a lot about what's going on in Gethsemane falls just into natural bodily matters. The Lord was being brought into feelings and fears for his natural life. Every body resists being killed. We want to survive. As we age and as we mature and as we look at the uses of life and come to understand what death is and what the afterlife is about, we may not be gripped with fear so that we would say, use any means possible to keep this old aging body alive. We might be relieved to say, let me go. And we have to make a choice about that, and we have to choose for other people. But the body itself is going to want to keep living. It's a body. It's a living body. And then it will fade away. These things are really hard to understand. Did I say that loud enough? Scarcely any clearer idea. That's that bottom paragraph. See what I did there? Isn't that cool? They're really hard to understand. So if you don't totally understand the doctrine of the Lord's glorified human and temptations in the Garden of Gethsemane, it's okay. It's very hard to understand. You need just a little purse to hold a few coins. And the Lord will take the coins that we have, take switching analogies and correspondences, the small seeds that we have of truth. By His own power, He will grow us, regenerate us, rebirth us. We will feel it as if of ourselves, but we have to have this separation of the things that are natural and the things that are divine and spiritual. So by the Lord's exercise of His own divine power, what's called the Mary human forever passed away. He lost his mother. Not Mary herself. He lost everything within himself that was his mother's. Now, if you're a mother or a father, you're a parent, if you've been a parent, think about your child. Think about yourself in relationship to your own parents. Having to give up everything about them. Some might be relieved for a few qualities that they don't really like. He had to let his mother die. As a matter of fact, he willfully went into the Garden of Gethsemane knowing that he's, quote unquote, as it were, within himself, killing his mother. Is that too severe or too strange to contemplate? By His own power, the Mary human forever passed away. And that which passed away was never to be resumed, never to be restored. We don't take up our old body, you know that. The state in question was granted no resurrection. The states, all that he ever knew about himself, being a human being walking on earth, and watching his developing divine human, but always having it within the body of Jesus, His Jewish male body, that had to die. All of his previous state prior was going to die. Duh, he's dying on the cross. But he's knowing all the depths of that and feeling every attachment issue that anybody, anywhere in the whole universe has towards those things that they love so dearly. Even the angels, their own proprial feelings, love so dearly. It's going to have to die. The proprium of the natural Mary has to die for the Lord to be glorified. Very, very painful. We can't really understand that. Even if we think about our own death, the Lord, we know from the power He gives us, will resurrect us. He knew from the divine within Him that He would be glorified, but knowing is one thing, and it's not quote-unquote book learning, but in one sense, all that Jesus had from this was what was given in the Word, that His divine soul could meet in the natural and then give him perceptions and sensations and awareness of. It's going to die. That natural is going to die. The state in question was granted no resurrection, namely the apparent state of separation between the Father and the Son. Now, I've just been talking about the Mary human, right? But it's the apparent separation also between Him having been the Son of Man, the Son of God. He's no longer going to have that role. Part of His consciousness, His thought, His Mary human thinking is not going to have that. He's going to lose both His father and His mother in one sense when He dies. He's looking down a very dark tunnel from the perspective of that human body dying. And yet we know, because we have the teachings of the Word, you should say, well, Jesus would know because He could raise Lazarus. He could raise Jairus' daughter. He knows He's going to be resurrected. My goodness, I'm going on too long. There was indeed forsaken, but not without a temptation so grave that the Lord, as yet in some part born of Mary, and because of the deep illusion pertaining to that state, he prayed that the temptation might pass from him. I'm going to go on. I'm going to go on. I'm going to go on. Spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. That's the end. The Lord's coming to these people and saying, you can't be with me. You can't stay awake. Your spirit's willing, but your flesh is weak. All of our flesh is weak. The Lord's own flesh was weak. This is about him. This is about us. This is about this state. He went away a first time and a second time and a third time. He used the same words. He came to his disciples. They said, "Sleep on now. Take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." And then the next part of the story is his arrest and all the horrible things that he did physically feel. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's there. He's being able to walk away, pray, get up, come back, walk away, talk to his disciples. The calm before the storm. And the next verse is Judas coming and kissing him. And he says, "You betray the Son of Man with a kiss." I was trying to explain to my students today, one of the students, well, it's sort of typical of this state. "Well, didn't he go to hell? Didn't Judas go to hell for that? He's probably in hell, right? Burning in hell." I said, well, you have to pay for all your sins on earth, right? I was saying, it says Judas was really upset. And he repented of this. He took the money back. He said, "I don't want this money." They said, "Who cares?" And then he hung himself. And we talk about the Lord's, at the second, June 19th, we talk about the Lord called together the 12 disciples that followed him. And so we can make a comparison of him coming to Simon over and over and over again, who's sleeping, and then later on, within hours of the story in Gethsemane, he's denying him 3 times. He goes and weeps as well. He doesn't commit suicide, but he wasn't the one who was responsible for the Lord's death in the way that Judas was. And Judas represents something very redeemable in us, like Peter does. We think maybe they're the top and the bottom of a spectrum of goodness if we're being good new church people. Peter, John, following the Lord to the end, writing the book of Revelation, all these 12 disciples, but Judas is probably, no, there's something in us that wants the Lord to miraculously do what we want him to do so that he doesn't die. Judas, keeper of the money, perhaps thought the Lord's going to I'm going to betray him, but he had said to them in the Gospels, he said, but be gentle with him. Or I think it is that's how it's put. And when he saw that they weren't, and they took him and they arrested him in the way they were treating him, he went and hung himself. They couldn't take the money and use it for anything in the treasury, so they bought a potter's field. Isn't that a strange, ironic thing? You're willing to give somebody money to kill somebody, and then you're going to apply the rules to the money that he throws down. That's part of us too. So Judas, did he repent? Is there something in us that has to die in this story? There's a lot in us that has to die in this story. There's a lot in us that is regretful. Jesus himself is regretful, asking if the cup could pass, asking if the death could not be the Lord's will, but nevertheless the Lord's will and not ours. When we're ready for these states to develop and grow and die, they will. When we're ready to understand certain things that seem so obscure or so hard to comprehend, we'll understand them. If it's not really important to the Lord's story with us to comprehend all these interior truths related to his glorification, we don't have to. We don't get to heaven because we've passed the test of what Apocalypse Explained 840.5, which I read earlier today, says. We get, the Lord brings us in heaven because we're willing to die for him. Parts of us, all of us. And we're willing to do it as if of ourselves. It'll feel like the Lord's abandoned us or feel like we've abandoned him at times, which we do, but he never abandons us. So with that, I'll close, literally.